Millions of Americans have been ordered to shelter in place during the COVID-19 global health crisis. It's an aggressive measure to attempt to control the spread of an aggressive virus. But what if in our confinement, we also commit to shelter in grace? On today's broadcast, Skip Heitzig searches Scripture for what it means to move beyond receiving God's grace to taking refuge in it. Learn to survive and thrive when life closes in. Ouch! We all learn to say that word very early on in life, and we continue to say it throughout our lives, even until the very end. Life hurts. Our lifespan is marked by life sorrows, but our response is what is central to the outcome. Let's hear from Murray and Francis.
Nothing could have prepared us for what we've been through during this global pandemic. Since half our family lives in Australia, the physical separation, especially not seeing our grandkids, has brought on a wide range of emotions. But we've learned not to let our emotions drive our response to this challenging season.
Scripture instructs us to pray without ceasing, and that has become our reality. Together we've come before the Lord to pray for our world, our nation, and of course our family and friends. God has called us to fast, intercede, and pray His word back to Him. He's brought us into a deeper relationship with Him as we've depended on Him more. We've also learned to delight in simple things, and we've been reminded of His promises, sovereignty, and plans for us. Our future is in His hands. We may not be able to control what's going on around us, but we can control our attitude and our response.
Today, Pastor Skip starts the second message in the series Shelter in Grace. We're learning how to deal with life struggles by studying the life of Job.
Let me just begin by saying I am not a huge boxing fan. I know that that's anathema to some people, especially some guys. I'm not really even a great sports guy. Maybe, so it sort of makes me less than a man because men are sort of like into sports, and I'm really bad at that. But, boxing has never been huge to me, but I read an article that made me really interested, and it caught my attention about Mark DeLuca. Now, Mark DeLuca is a professional boxer from Boston, Massachusetts, and before this past February, before just a couple months ago, he had never been knocked down once. So he has had 25 professional fights, never once knocked down. On February 8th, he was knocked down by a world champion in the UK by the name of Ezekiel or Kell Brook. And Kell Brook, I guess, has a mean left hook. That kind of rhymes, doesn't it? The hook from Brook. Well, he delivered a left hook to Mark DeLuca's face, and he just fell down. He collapsed. He got back up on the count of 4. There's a 10 count of 4. He got back up again, and he kept fighting, but he was knocked down again in the 7th round, and his opponent won the fight. But the article went on to say that afterwards, it made him even more determined to get back to the gym, to get back into the ring, and to get back at it. And I love that article because it reminded me of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9, where the Apostle Paul said, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed and broken. We are perplexed, but we do not give up and quit. We are hunted down, but God never abandons us. We get knocked down, but we get up again and keep going." Down, but not out. That's the name of this message this weekend. Down, but not out. And actually, that article reminded me a little bit of Job, because Job got beaten up pretty badly by life. He was knocked down. He lost everything. He lost his family. He lost his wealth. He lost his personal health. He even lost his shelter. His home was destroyed, as we read. But he learns to shelter in grace. He learns to shelter in God's grace. You know, over the past few weeks, our staff has made numerous phone calls to people in our own flock here in the Albuquerque and New Mexico area. I've made personal calls, all of our pastors have, our staff has reached out to people, and what we're discovering is just how resilient God's people are. That, yes, it's tough. Yes, this is a massive inconvenience. Yes, we're very careful about what might happen, but at the same time, people are comforted in God. They're sheltering in God's grace. They're leaning into Him. They're being ministered to through His Word. They're thankful for the content that is provided. They're looking for ways to reach out and help others in the community. There's a real positive note that I've noticed among God's people that's been encouraging. Now, the book of Job is built around 2 episodes of suffering that are mentioned in the first 2 chapters. There probably were more times, but these 2 are highlighted, and then the rest of the book is filled with lengthy discussions. So most of the book, the bulk of it, is a series of debates between Job and his friends. I call them friends, but they were acquaintances. Maybe they started out as friends, but they start debating Job as to the nature of his suffering and why would God allow this? What is God doing? And let me just say right off the bat, it's never a good idea to debate with somebody who is suffering. That really isn't a good approach. Don't debate with them. Now, these guys who do come are great friends at first because they don't say anything. They sit there. In fact, they come from a long distance, and for 7 days, they say nothing. They just sit with Job. And I love that. You know, there's something we call the ministry of presence. You just being there for somebody. If you've ever been in a hospital and you've woken up and you look across the room to see a friend just sitting there, boy, that means an awful lot to somebody who is going through a disease or being hospitalized. So they did that. They came, they sat for an entire week, but then they blew it because they opened their mouth and they started talking. And what it became like the guy in the ring who gets the left hook and falls to the ground, and the fans are screaming at him negative things. They're not really helping him. They're not really encouraging him. They're just disappointed that the guy is down. Let me give a word to the healthy, those who are not suffering. You're suffering maybe right now an inconvenience with COVID-19, but if you're dealing with somebody who is physically suffering, physically disadvantaged, don't try to explain everything to them. Don't be the person who's there to answer all the why questions. That will come, but answering them now or debating with them or explaining, that never heals a broken heart. I always say to people, walk softly around a broken heart. Just be there. Just listen to them. Put an arm around them, or you can't do that these days, but give them a verbal embrace and encourage them in the Lord. Now, in the first 2 chapters, which we're going to look at, we just had a sort of an introduction last time. We look at 4 stages to Job's episode of suffering. And these 4 stages help for us to answer some crucial questions. Questions like, how do I deal with loss? Do I just survive? Do I just make my way through it? Do I grin and bear it? Or can I actually grow through it? In fact, can I worship in the midst of it? Now, if you know anything about this book, and I have a hunch that most of you have read it, or at least you're familiar with the first couple of chapters in it, you know that it is the antithesis of the classic rags to riches story. We love rags to riches story. We love hearing about people who grew up in a slum, they were disadvantaged, raised by a single mom, didn't make it to good schools, but then they become like a brain surgeon, or they become a university professor or something. Those are great stories. What we don't like is what's presented here. It is not a rags to riches story. It's a riches to rags. It's the opposite direction. This guy loses it all. And Job's response is classic. Job's response reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said when he was asked, "Why do the righteous suffer?" He heard that question. Why do the righteous suffer? And here's what he said, why not? They're the only ones who can take it. I want you to see how Job takes it, because really it is the quintessential example of how a believer should do that. So we have 4 stages, as I mentioned. The first stage is just the reality of his life. And we're introduced again to Job in chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. So the reality of Job's life is that he was blameless, but he was buffeted. But we take the first part, he was blameless. Notice the description of him. He says he was blameless. The King James says perfect. Now that doesn't mean sinlessly perfect, it just means morally innocent. He didn't lack anything in purity. He was a man of moral integrity. Then when it says he was upright, that means he's somebody who went straight ahead and didn't veer off the path. He didn't stray from the path that he was on. He was moral, he was upright before God, and he never veered off that path. And then it amplifies it by saying he feared God and shunned evil. So the reason he was so upright and blameless is because of that fact. He feared God, and when you fear God, you're able to shun evil. One follows the other. Now this description of Job should end the notion that people have that godly people don't suffer. Because this guy was so godly that even God brags about him to the world's worst enemy, the devil. Twice, have you considered my servant Job? God will say to him. So this should just put to rest the whole idea that godly people don't suffer, or if I'm suffering as a Christian, it's because God is punishing me and somehow I've sinned or I've fallen short. Or, as some people say, if I only had enough faith, then I wouldn't be suffering this malady or this disease. If I was a person of great faith, I would walk in perfect health. What the book of Job shows is there's not always a direct correlation or cause and effect relationship between suffering and righteousness. Because if there were, Job never would have suffered a day in his life, because he was so blameless, so upright. So there's not always a direct cause and effect. Sometimes the best people suffer the worst things. Sometimes the creeps of this world seem to get by with a lot. So he is blameless. That's the first part of the reality. But though he was blameless, he was also buffeted. And that's really a word that's an understatement. I want you to see how he was buffeted. Beginning in verse 13 of the first chapter, it reads, "Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, took them away, yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you." Several quick-fire disasters fall upon Job in a short period of time. I could sum them up by 3 categories: terrorism, natural disaster, and disease. Or you even might say international terrorism, I'll explain that, natural disaster, and then physical disease. In the first couple of verses, it talks about the Sabians and the Chaldeans coming. This is terrorism. Sabians were a tribe from Arabia. Chaldeans were a nomadic tribe from Babylonia. In the story of Job, the Sabians first raided and depleted his wealth that was in his livestock. Then the Chaldeans came and took the camels and killed his staff. That's terrorism. Now, there's always a question about terrorism because it's very prevalent in our society. Well before COVID-19, the world was and is suffering in different pockets around the globe terrorism. It's become a concern in the last 2 decades, more than ever before. When September 11th happened, the big question, why would God allow terrorism? I heard that question asked to me personally. I worked the hold, it is called, at Ground Zero in New York City, right after the towers fell for 3 weeks. I was at the morgue in New York with families who were discovering DNA remains of their relatives, and only to find out that their relatives were dead, turning to me and saying, why would God allow that kind of terrorist attack? And now with COVID-19, people are even discussing the possibility of biological warfare, wondering, was this a part of that, or could there be biological warfare like this in the future? Listen to this. According to the U.S. State Department, in the past 2 decades, 21,000 deaths every year come from terrorism. That is a reality of our present world. It was in Job's world. It is in this world. 21,000 people per annum every year killed by terrorism. Second, natural disaster. We read in our story that lightning falls from heaven. That's fire from God. It causes a fire. Then a sudden wind comes to sort of exacerbate things and bring destruction. Again, natural disaster is something the world has always had. And according to the World Health Organization, there are estimates that natural disasters kill 90,000 people every year. This is God's world. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Why? We've talked about that in previous studies here. The third thing is disease. Now, I take you to chapter 2 to see that, because things go from bad to worse. In verse 7 of chapter 2, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he, Job, took for himself a potsherd, this little piece of pottery, with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of ashes. That's his physical condition for the remainder of the book. He suffers this. He can't sleep because of it. He has convulsions. He has night terrors, the book goes on to say. We don't exactly know what Job's physical condition was. We can guess. There are several physicians and commentators tried to guess. It's sort of hard after the fact, a posteriori, to diagnose a patient's condition. Some have said this is the early stages of leprosy. Others say it's renal failure. Others say it's a rare skin disease. Sort of the general consensus is it's a condition known as elephantiasis. You can go Google that, not now, but later on, and find out what that is all about. But here's the point. One moment, Job, blameless, upright, godly, prays for his family. One moment, Job is enjoying his life, eating falafels with his family, and maybe a shawarma sandwich, and then suddenly it's all taken away. It's all gone. That's how some people feel about the conditions of this world. Boy, just a few weeks ago we were all together having fun, and then this. And now the economy. In verse 8, just notice that, kind of walk away with that snapshot in your heart. He took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. Just picture Job, The ashes is the city dump. It's outside the city. It's where dogs feed on whatever scraps are there. It's where dung is burned. It's where the city's garbage is taken. And now the city's leading citizen, Job, is living there with a little pot, broken pottery, scraping himself because he's itching from these sores. Job is now a social outcast. Job is now in a rotting slum. He believes in God. What should he do? Well, that takes us to the second stage after the reality of Job's life. Let's look at the response of Job's heart. In chapter 1, verse 20, it says, "Then Job arose, tore his robe." That's a Middle Eastern form of deep grief and disgust. To tear a robe, it's a response. "And shaved his head." Now, we don't quite get that, but the idea is that I've lost my glory and I want to show that I have. "And he fell to the ground." So he tears his robe, shaves his head, and he collapses. And I've seen people do this. I've seen people, when delivered news like your son or your daughter has died, or your wife or husband has died, I've seen people physically collapse under the weight of this horrible news. Which shows you that Job is no super spiritual, detached, aloof, stoic. He is understandably shaken to the core, emotionally shaken. Now, if the text stopped there, and it didn't, I didn't even finish the verse, but if the text just said he stood up, tore his clothes, shaved his head, and collapsed, if it just stopped there and went on to the next verse, we would understand. But it doesn't stop there. There's a description afterwards that takes our breath away, because it says, "And he worshiped." Yeah, he went through all of the grief. He tore his robe. He collapsed on the ground in grief. And then he worshiped. He worshiped, and he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. Is that really possible? I mean, come on, is it really possible when things get that bad, when you lose children and health and all of your wealth, and the stock market is crazy down at the bottom, and everything's negative, and everybody's worried about death and life and the economy recovering? Can people worship in the midst of that? Yes, they can. And here's why. Pain moves people. It always does. Pain moves people in one of two directions: closer to God or further from God. Pain, suffering, hardship will either break your back or it will bend your knee. Some people become bitter when they suffer. They turn inward. They get filled with self-pity. They complain. They are so resentful at life. I bet you know people like that. Hopefully you're not a person like that. But some become bitter. Others, I wouldn't classify them as being bitter. I'd say others are battered. Oh, they bear it. They go through it. They weather the storm, but that's about all. You can see it. They're just beat up. They're just weathered. They're just tired. Fatalistic, nihilistic. They really see no purpose in this. It's all meaningless, like Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. So some become bitter, some become battered, but some become better. Now, I'm not just saying that as a clever talking point or a rally cry. Come on, we can be better. I mean that really they become better people. Right. That's right. I got a letter from a girl just the other day, an email. Her name is Jen. Beautiful little note. She said, "I grew up in Calvary and by your teachings. When I was 16, I gave my life to the Lord. However, when I turned 18, I rebelled." I bet we can relate with that, or we have children that we can relate with. "For the majority of my adult life, I have lived how I wanted to live. But then this virus hit. and it was the wake-up call that I needed. 4 weeks ago, I rededicated my life to the Lord. I have never experienced such peace in my heart. This is in the midst of COVID-19. I've never experienced such peace in my heart. I'm hungry, ravenous even for the Word. I know that the Holy Spirit is with me, and I praise Him for my salvation. This pandemic moved Jen in the right direction. It moved her toward God. She became better. And the truth is, sometimes the Lord will calm the storm. Most times He will calm His child in the storm. She's calm. She has peace even now. Then I got another little note just the other day, maybe a day ago, from somebody in our worship team, plays here. They were here Wednesday night doing the keyboards. They have a nephew on a cruise ship that is quarantined off the coast of France on their way to Hamburg, Germany. They happened to watch our Wednesday night service, and they watched, this nephew watched with several of the crew members who really up to this point weren't interested at all in things of God, but suddenly they are now. They listened to the sermon, they listened to the message, then later they asked this man, this believer, to come and speak to them and to pray with them. And he says, now they're hungry for the truth, and many of them responded to the gospel.
Each month, we feature a special resource that we believe will enhance your Christian journey. This month, we bring you a thrilling new book from best-selling author Joel C. Rosenberg. This month, our resource offer is the hardcover book, The Jerusalem Assassin, by New York Times best-selling author Joel Rosenberg. The Jerusalem Assassin unveils an unthinkable plot that turns all eyes towards Jerusalem and puts an American president in the crosshairs. The political world is rocked by a peace treaty between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Brokered by the United States, the historic peace summit in Jerusalem is the perfect platform for a presidential assassination. Read The Jerusalem Assassin from Joel C. Rosenberg. Order your copy of The Jerusalem Assassin by calling 1-800-922-1888 or at connectwithskip.com. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on Connect with Skip Heitzig. We're connecting you to God's never-changing truth in ever-changing times.